The storm of 1835 struck the California coast with unprecedented fury. Gray waves crashed mercilessly against the rocky shores of San Nicolas Island, turning the salty water into thick foam. The wind tore the tops off the sandy hills, mixing icy spray with fine skin-cutting sand. The heavy wooden rescue ship struggled to hold its anchor in the churning black water. The ship slowly drifted away from the shore, its heavy sails fluttering under the blows of the squall-driven ocean wind. The woman stood motionless at the very edge of the surf, feeling the icy water wash over her bare feet. There was no turning back, for the dark barrier of water was rapidly expanding with every passing second. She kept staring into the distance until the wooden hull had completely vanished from view. The cold air stung her lungs with every breath, and her soaked clothes clung to her shivering body. The night mist finally enveloped the island, depriving the woman of her last visual connection to the rest of the world. In the impenetrable darkness, the sounds of snapping branches seemed like the footsteps of sailors or relatives coming back for her. In the darkness, she did not yet know that this was only the very beginning of her incredibly long journey. Ahead of her lay thousands of such cold and dark nights without the slightest human warmth. The silent ocean had become an insurmountable wall of ice, forever cutting her off from any possible rescue and civilization. They did not know this aboard the departing ship, but this was the moment their great rescue expedition came to an end. A harsh chronicle of solitary survival began, where nature never made any allowances for human weakness.
The wind is shifting north sooner than expected.
The expedition to San Nicolas Island had been planned in advance with the sole purpose of retrieving the remaining local inhabitants. The tribe's population had dwindled critically following brutal clashes with sea otter hunters in past decades. The rescue vessel dropped anchor in the bay, while the weather still seemed relatively calm and predictable. The captain had planned to load the people and their modest belongings in a single short daylight hour. None of the experienced sailors had foreseen such a sudden and catastrophic deterioration in weather conditions by evening. The process of gathering belongings turned into utter chaos when the first heavy clouds appeared on the horizon. At first, none of the sailors wanted to say it out loud, so as not to cause premature panic among the Indians. They still believed that the rescue would go smoothly and the ship would manage to leave the dangerous bay in time. But every crew member already clearly understood that the situation was rapidly and irreversibly worsening with every passing minute. Panic began to spread among the people on shore much faster than the cold approaching from the ocean. A woman was helping to load heavy bundles of hides, constantly shuttling between the ruined village and the surf line. In the commotion, she became separated from the main group of her tribesmen, returning to a distant hut for a forgotten item. No one kept precise passenger lists under conditions where the ship's wooden hull could shatter against the rocks. The sailors began to economize on words just as they economized on time, communicating exclusively through brief gestures. Everyone understood that the time for safe anchorage in the bay was far from infinite and was rapidly running out. When the woman ran back to the beach, the last overloaded rowboat had already pushed off from the sandy shore. The sailors were straining with all their might on the heavy oars, trying to break through the wall of oncoming waves. Someone on the shore was still trying to wave their arms, but a thick veil of rain hid them from the crew's view. The silence of misunderstanding between those left on land and those sailing away became heavier than the hurricane-force wind itself. The captain on the bridge gave the final order to cut the anchor rope to save the ship from certain doom. At the port of arrival, no one organized a new rescue mission due to the lack of a suitable vessel and funding. The question in the officials' offices was not whether all the Indians remaining on the island would survive. The question was only which of the sailors would be the last to remain to testify about what had happened. The ocean reliably concealed San Nicolas Island, behind a wall of constant fog and unceasing winter storms. The abandoned woman became an inconvenient ghost whom everyone preferred to forget as soon as possible. For her, however, it was the moment after which absolutely everything changed forever and irrevocably. The tragic story of her unprecedented loneliness had already begun to unfold against the backdrop of the raging elements. There was no turning back. The ocean had become an insurmountable barrier between her and the rest of humanity. None of the officials on the mainland yet understood the true scale of what was happening on the distant island. They still hoped that nature would take pity on her, But hope never changes harsh reality. The first morning after the devastating storm greeted the island with a cold light and the unnatural calm of the ocean. The storm had subsided, leaving behind only seaweed washed ashore and the debris of dead trees. The woman slowly emerged from her makeshift shelter, squinting against the bright rays of the sun on the empty beach. The outside world was too far away to notice her solitary figure against the backdrop of the endless waters. Help could arrive at any moment, or it might never come again in her lifetime. She spent several hours gazing at the flat line of the horizon, hoping to see white sails. On that clear day, the endless countdown to her long years spent in complete and absolute isolation began. This was not a quick end to her life. It was only the beginning of a real, exhausting daily ordeal. From that very moment, time became her chief and most merciless enemy on that lifeless patch of land. The wild nature made no distinction between an experienced sailor and a lone, defenseless woman. Hunger forced her to tear her gaze away from the empty horizon and take action to save herself. Her entire future now hinged solely on the here and now, with no room for even the slightest mistake. A very long journey of survival lay ahead of her, and not everyone in such stories makes it to the very end. She walked around the ruined village, gathering the baskets and stone tools of her ancestors that had survived the storm. The smell of wet ash from the extinguished fires reminded her of the people she would never see again. By the evening of the second day, she realized the scale of the disaster after circling the entire island. She found not a single living person, not a single surviving boat capable of withstanding the surf. Physical exhaustion began to take its toll, forcing her to stop frequently to catch her breath. Her toes, frost-bitten during the storm, ached sharply with every step on the sharp rocks. The feeling of complete isolation weighed on her shoulders heavier than the heaviest bundle of firewood she had gathered. The nights brought with them a sharp drop in temperature and a paralyzing, primal fear of the dark. Without a fire, she was completely defenseless against the cold, which penetrated deep beneath her damp skin. She had to burrow into piles of dry sand and old seaweed to preserve the last shreds of warmth. In moments like these, she began to speak aloud, just to hear some kind of human voice. The sound of her own words frightened her, as it echoed off the empty walls of the abandoned huts. She quickly realized that the most dangerous thing on this island was not the biting cold, but utter despair. If she gave in and simply lay down on the sand, death would take her quietly and completely unnoticed. She no longer counted the days spent in solitude. She counted her slim chances of survival. Gradually, her hope for the ship's imminent return began to fade, giving way to the cold calculation of a survivor. She stopped standing on the shore for hours, wasting precious time staring pointlessly into the empty distance. Her focus narrowed to solving simple daily tasks, finding food, finding water, staying warm. The end of the first week became a kind of turning point for her, separating her past life from her new reality. She was no longer part of the tribe. She had become an integral part of this harsh island landscape. The cold air continued to burn her lungs, but she had learned to breathe slowly and very sparingly. The endless ice of isolation had frozen her soul, leaving no room for empty and meaningless illusions. The beginning of her solitude was behind her. Ahead lay a vast ocean of time that she would have to cross alone. The village's old huts proved too fragile to withstand the constant ocean winds for long. The rains quickly washed away the earthen roofs, turning the once warm houses into damp, cold pits. She needed a reliable shelter capable of protecting her fragile body from the approaching winter storms. A solution was found at the far end of the beach, where powerful tides had been washing up the remains of sea giants for decades. Huge white whale ribs lay on the sand, resembling the ancient ruins of some temple forgotten by God. These colossal bones were stronger than any wood and completely resistant to decay in saltwater. The woman began methodically dragging these heavy skeletal fragments closer to the site of her future camp. It was exhausting labor, draining every last ounce of her meager physical strength. Each bone weighed too much for a single emaciated person, making her muscles scream in pain. She had to use a system of levers made from tree trunks washed up on the shore to move them. Her hands were covered in bloody calluses that didn't have time to heal due to constant contact with the salt water. Physical exhaustion had reached that critical point where every movement triggered a wave of intense nausea, but she continued her grueling work, for stopping meant certain death from the cold. Inside her new shelter, it was cramped and dark, but completely dry and sheltered from the ocean wind. She paved the floor with flat stones heated by the sun so they would give off their warmth on cold nights. This small space became her personal fortress, the only safe place on the entire vast planet. Here she could relax for a brief moment, allowing her tense muscles to get at least a short respite. The isolation around her felt less acute here, held at bay by sturdy walls made of whale bones. Creating this refuge was her first major victory over ruthless circumstances in the wild. She proved to herself that she was capable of fighting and surviving despite the complete absence of any hope for help. But this victory came at a colossal cost. Her body had wasted away, her eyes were deeply sunken, and her skin had grown rough. She looked far older than her years, having become a shadow of the woman who had remained on the shore. Her physical condition had deteriorated, but her will to live had grown stronger than the sturdiest whale rib. Within the walls of her new hut, she spent long, dark evenings listening to the howling wind outside. She began to decorate the walls with carved patterns on bones, to somehow brighten the absolute emptiness. These primitive drawings were her only means of communication, a message to nowhere that no one would ever read. The silence inside the shelter was thick and heavy. You could literally cut through it with a stone knife. This silence slowly but surely drove her mad, making her doubt her own reality. Hope for salvation had long since left these walls, giving way to the mechanical routine of daily survival. Nature simply existed around her, indifferent to her pain, fears, and small architectural victories. She had built a house, but this house was completely empty, just like the entire dead world surrounding her. Without a constant source of fire, life on the windswept island was impossible and doomed to end. Matches did not exist, and the old embers in the abandoned village had long since cooled and turned to gray dust. She had to reinvent the way to produce a flame, using only stones, dry grass, and sheer determination. Days were spent on fruitless attempts to strike a spark from flint, rubbing her fingers raw to the bone. The cold laughed mercilessly at her efforts, freezing her hands and robbing them of the sensitivity needed to work. Every morning began with the monotonous and exhausting ritual of rubbing dry sticks against a piece of soft wood. The muscles in her arms burned with tension, but the desired result, a saving wisp of smoke, never appeared. Disappointment washed over her in heavy waves, forcing her to throw down her tools and weep helplessly in despair on the sand. In those moments, she understood clearly that without warmth, her body would simply give out in the coming days. The freezing air stung her face, reminding her that time for experiments was rapidly and inexorably running out. The warmth of the fire transformed her life, allowing her to dry her wet clothes and warm her frozen limbs. She was able to cook hot food, baking plant roots and the meat of small mollusks in the hot ashes. This significantly improved her physical condition, halting the rapid loss of weight and strength. The fire drove away her nighttime fears, creating an illusion of safety in the middle of a vast and hostile ocean. The light of the flames danced on the walls made of whale bones, serving as a substitute for the company of other living people. But keeping the fire going required iron discipline and constant vigilance throughout the night. She learned to sleep in short bursts, waking every hour to toss life-saving firewood into the hearth. Chronic sleep deprivation became her new enemy, clouding her mind and causing severe bouts of daytime weakness. A single strong gust of wind during a winter storm nearly destroyed all her colossal efforts. Rain flooded the hearth, and the flames began to die down rapidly, hissing and releasing thick clouds of white steam. In a panic, she covered the coals with her own body, suffering severe burns on her hands and chest. She managed to save the last handful of smoldering coals, but this incident revealed the fragility of her existence. Over the years, the fire in her hut never went out, becoming a symbol of her incredible resilience and stubbornness. She built complex protective screens out of stones and bones to shield the hearth from any vagaries of the weather. This flame became the only bright spot on the entire island, visible from afar on dark polar nights. The battle for the fire ended in her unconditional victory, but this victory did not bring the salvation she had hoped for. It simply gave her the opportunity to continue her endless existence in total isolation. The heat sustained life in her body, but it could not fill the vast emptiness in her lonely heart. Nature had come to terms with the presence of this tiny fire on her body, allowing her to play at survival. Time passed, the firewood burned, turning to ash, just as the years of her lost human life burned away. San Nicolas Island was extremely sparse in plant life, offering only meager, tough roots. The cold and merciless ocean surrounding the island became her main source of survival. The daily search for food turned into a harsh routine where the slightest mistake threatened starvation. She wandered for hours over the slippery rocks at low tide, gathering mussels, crabs, and small shellfish. The icy water stung her feet, and the sharp edges of the shells left deep cuts that took a long time to heal. To catch large fish, she had to recall her tribe's ancient methods and weave sturdy fishing lines. She fashioned hooks from abalone shells, carefully grinding them against stones until they were perfectly sharp. Fishing required immense patience and the ability to sit motionless for hours in the biting ocean wind. Luck did not smile upon her nearly every day, and she often returned to the hut completely empty-handed. On such days, weakness gripped her body, reminding her of the fragile balance between life and starvation. Seal pups and seals basking on distant beaches became her main and most coveted prey. But hunting these large and powerful animals posed a colossal risk for a lone woman. She had to crawl up to them on the wet sand, blending into the terrain and holding her breath. The strike with her homemade spear had to be precise and deadly. Otherwise, the enraged beast could easily kill her. The fear of being mauled constantly battled the agonizing hunger tearing at her empty stomach. Collecting bird eggs in the spring was a true celebration, offering a rare chance to diversify her meager diet. She scrambled up sheer cliffs, risking at any moment to fall and shatter on the coastal rocks. The birds fiercely defended their nests, pecking at her head and hands until fresh, warm blood appeared. But the instinct for self-preservation was stronger than the pain, driving her to fill her bag with precious, warm eggs. Hunger was changing her physically. Her body had become sinewy, her muscles withered, and her skin stretched tightly over her protruding bones. Her face had sharpened, taking on a predatory, almost animalistic expression, forever stripped of its former feminine softness. Her gaze became sharp and constantly searching, automatically scanning every movement around her for food. She no longer ate for pleasure. The act of eating had turned into a mechanical shoveling of fuel into a furnace. The taste of food ceased to matter. The only thing that mattered was the number of life-saving morsels she swallowed. Drinking water remained a constant problem, especially during the dry summer months on the island. She had to collect morning dew from sparse leaves and use hollowed-out stones to catch rainwater. Dehydration caused severe headaches and clouded her mind, making her steps uncertain and unsteady. At such moments, she would fall to the ground, licking moisture directly from the cold stones like a wild animal. Pride and human dignity had long since given way to the absolute biological necessity of survival. A full stomach allowed her mind to temporarily distract itself from the pain and once again realize the full horror of complete isolation. She sat on the shore, chewing dried meat, and stared at the same empty, indifferent horizon. Food kept a spark of life burning within her, but it could not give her the most important thing, a reason to continue this life. The old clothes she had brought with her to the island quickly turned into filthy rags rotting on her body. The winds and rains of San Nicolas mercilessly tore at the fabric, leaving her skin defenseless against the elements. The cold air bit painfully into the exposed parts of her body, causing her to shiver constantly from hypothermia. Creating new reliable protection from the wind became a matter of life and death in the very first months of her isolation. Without sturdy clothing, all her attempts to stay warm by the fire would have been utterly pointless and futile. The materials for her new clothing were the glossy feathers of cormorants and the thick, greasy hides of slain seals. She carefully stripped the skin from the animal carcasses, using sharp shards of stone instead of the iron knives she was accustomed to. The process of tanning the hides was incredibly dirty, time-consuming, and demanded tremendous physical effort from the woman. She had to scrape the inside of the hides for hours, removing the remains of fat and rotting flesh. The stench was unbearable, permeating her own hair and skin so thoroughly that it was impossible to get rid of. To sew the pieces of leather together, she used animal tendons, which she dried and split into thin threads. Instead of needles, she used sharp fish bones, into which she painstakingly carved tiny eyes. Wearing the skins also had significant drawbacks that caused her a great deal of physical discomfort. The stiff leather rubbed her body raw, causing bloody blisters, especially in the areas where her elbows constantly bent. During the warmer months, sweat would accumulate under her thick clothing, causing severe itching and skin inflammation. Making sturdy footwear proved to be an even more difficult task than sewing a dress out of bird feathers. Sharp rocks and prickly plants quickly wore out any primitive sandals woven from dry grass. She began making rough moccasins from the thickest pieces of sealskin, wrapping them around her feet. On long winter evenings, sitting by her hearth, she was constantly mending torn clothing. This activity turned into a kind of meditation, helping to distract her mind from the oppressive thoughts of loneliness. The sound of piercing leather and the creaking of stretched tendons filled the oppressive silence inside the shelter. Sometimes she would decorate her outfits with small, beautiful seashells she found on the shore at low tide. This tiny, seemingly meaningless act of creativity helped her preserve what remained of her human dignity. In a world where everything boiled down to satisfying basic needs, these shells were a symbol of hope. The wind continued to tear at her clothes furiously, testing the strength of every bone-stitched seam she had created. But she stubbornly mended the tears, not letting the cold seep into her emaciated, weary body. These garments of skins and feathers had become her second skin, her protective armor against an indifferent world. In them, she blended into the island's landscape, becoming invisible to the foreign, hypothetical eyes of rescuers. By creating a new shell for herself, she severed all visual ties to her distant past. The woman in European rags had died, giving way to a feathered creature perfectly adapted to the island. This process of transformation was agonizing, yet vital for survival in the wild and harsh wilderness. The clothing protected her body, but could not warm her frozen human soul, slowly fading away from despair. She stood on the shore, clad in furs, and gazed out at the empty ocean with eyes full of hopelessness. The first years of isolation were marked by a constant, agonizing wait for white sails to appear on the horizon. Every day she climbed the island's highest hill, straining her eyes into the blue distance until they ached. Every white speck of foam on the crest of a wave seemed to her like the long-awaited ship coming to her rescue. Her heart would stop in her chest, her breath would catch, but the mirage would fade, leaving only bitter disappointment. This constant, throbbing hope caused more pain than the harshest winter, hunger, or cold. Gradually, she began to understand the terrible truth. No one would come back for her to this God-forsaken place. The realization of this fact did not come all at once, but slowly, drop by drop, poisoning her already weary mind. The outside world had struck her name from the list of the living, either counting her as a victim of the storm or simply forgetting she existed. It was the moment of her final emotional breakdown when her illusions shattered against the hard reality of the island's cliffs. Her most dangerous enemy was no longer the storm or hunger, but this all-consuming, black despair. The loss of hope led to the deepest apathy as she spent entire days in the hut, staring at a single point. Her movements became mechanical, devoid of any meaningful motive other than blind biological instinct. She continued to breathe, eat, and keep the fire going, because to stop meant making the difficult choice in favor of death. And she lacked both the strength and the emotion for suicide. She was too drained for any action. The days merged into a single gray, endless stretch, devoid of any meaning, beginning, or foreseeable end. Memories of her past life began to fade, losing their vivid colors and clear, familiar outlines. The faces of her loved ones turned into blurry smudges, and their names sounded in her head like a meaningless jumble of sounds. Sometimes, in moments of brief clarity, she was overcome by fits of wild, uncontrollable animal panic. She screamed, throwing herself against the walls of her bone hut, smashing her hands to a pulp against the hard ribs of the whales. There were no words in these screams, only the primal terror of a creature trapped in an endless, inescapable trap. Resignation to her fate came like a cold fog, enveloping her mind in a thick, impenetrable shroud. She no longer awaited the future, because on this island, a future simply did not exist for her. Time lost its familiar linear nature, transforming into a cyclical repetition of the same actions. Her attitude toward the world around her had changed. She no longer saw the island as her temporary prison. The island had become her entire world, her universe, whose boundaries coincided with the line of the foamy ocean surf. She knew every crack in the rocks, every path laid by seals, every bend in the shoreline. Complete solitude no longer frightened her so much. It had become her natural, familiar state. The presence of another person would now have seemed to her an intrusion into her perfectly tuned microcosm of survival. She had learned to draw strength from this isolation, finding in it a strange, distorted sense of perverse peace. The loss of hope did not kill her physically, but it forever killed the woman she had once been. She survived, but the price of that survival was more terrifying than the cruelest and swiftest physical death in the ocean. She surrendered her human form, her language, and her emotions to nature in exchange for the right to simply breathe. The world continued to exist without her, and she continued to exist without the world, frozen in timelessness. This was not the end of her story. It was a torturous, endless suspension over a deep black abyss. Years of complete absence of human communication began to have a devastating effect on her ability to speak. Her vocal cords, unused for their intended purpose, gradually atrophied, making her sounds hoarse and guttural. At first she talked to herself, but over time these monologues became shorter and more meaningless. Words lost their meaning, turning into empty shells, incapable of describing the dead reality surrounding her. The need to formulate thoughts vanished, giving way to simple instinctive reactions to cold or hunger. She began to communicate with the world through the language of nature's sounds, mimicking the cries of birds and the howl of the strong wind. This was not a conscious decision, but a natural deterioration of her communication skills under conditions of total isolation. The inner dialogue that had once helped her keep her sanity finally fell silent, giving way to a ringing void. Thoughts lost their verbal form, transforming into vague, fragmentary images and indistinct tactile sensations. Human speech was slowly dying within her, leaving behind only a deep, impenetrable silence. This silence was not merely the absence of sound. It was a physically palpable substance pressing against her eardrums. It filled every corner of the island, seeped into the hut, and settled deep inside her own head. Sometimes the silence became so oppressive that she had to strike stone against stone to break it. Her psyche had adapted to this silence by developing new, primitive mechanisms for perceiving the surrounding reality. She had become incredibly sensitive to the slightest changes in her environment. The rustle of sand, a shift in the wind's direction. Her senses had sharpened to an animalistic degree, compensating for the complete loss of her ability to communicate verbally. From time to time, fragments of old tribal songs she had once sung as a child would surface in her mind. She tried to hum them, but only strange, frightening wheezes, devoid of their former melody, escaped her throat. These failed attempts to sing caused her emotional pain, reminding her of how much she had irretrievably lost. The lack of communication had erased the boundaries of her individuality, turning her into a faceless creature, part of the island's fauna. She no longer perceived herself as a separate person with her own desires and unique past. Her actions were dictated solely by the present moment and the survival needs of a specific physical body. Only the fire in her hut remained the sole element connecting her to the world of sentient beings. Maintaining the flame was a meaningful act, requiring planning and an understanding of cause and effect. It was her only daily act of creation, standing in opposition to the entropy and destruction of the wild. Years passed, turning into decades, and she still roamed the island, a silent shadow in feathers. Her figure had blended so completely with the landscape that she became indistinguishable against the backdrop of gray rocks and parched shrubs. The world had forgotten her existence, and she had forgotten the existence of the world beyond her small island. The continent, located just a few dozen miles away, seemed like another unreachable universe, devoid of meaning. She didn't need people. She didn't need help. She had forgotten how to need anyone but herself. It was a state of perfect, terrifying equilibrium in which she could have lived out the rest of her days. Nothing foreshadowed change. Each new day was an exact, indistinguishable copy of the previous cold day. But history had other plans, preparing for her the final, most difficult, and fateful trial of her life. The silence that had protected her for 18 long years was soon to be shattered by the voices of strangers. She did not yet know that the end of her solitude would mark the beginning of her swift, tragic, and inevitable end. In the year 1853, the island's silence was suddenly shattered by a sound that had not been heard here for years. The creaking of oars and the clatter of wooden hulls against the pebbles heralded the arrival of a foreign, unexpected expedition. Hunter George Nidiver and his men landed on the shore, pursuing purely commercial hunting objectives. They were not looking for people here. They were looking for rookeries of valuable fur seals for quick and easy profit. The sight of a sail on the horizon no longer stirred any emotion in her, other than a primal animal fear. The sailors roamed the island, talking loudly in a rough and harsh English she didn't understand. Their voices cut through her ears, unaccustomed to any sounds other than the cries of seagulls and the roar of the ocean surf. She cautiously tracked their movements, darting from cover to cover with the agility of a wild animal. Her main task was to prevent them from discovering her hut made of whale bones and her carefully concealed hearth. But it was physically impossible to hide all traces of 18 years of living on this small patch of land. The hunters stumbled upon clear footprints of bare human feet in the wet sand near the shoreline. This discovery sent them into a state of deep shock, as the island had been officially considered completely uninhabited for decades. They began a targeted search, following her tracks like hounds tracking a wounded beast. The search area rapidly narrowed as they approached her carefully camouflaged hideout on the distant beach. Panic, long forgotten, once again gripped her fear-shrunken, hollowly pounding heart with an icy grip. Soon they discovered her strange hut made of bones and stopped in amazement before this wild structure. She sat inside, curled up in a ball, clutching her primitive bone knife in her hand, ready to sell her life dearly. When the first sailor peered inside, she made not a sound, merely staring at him with an unblinking, predatory gaze. There was no plea for mercy in her eyes. They revealed only a readiness for an immediate, desperate lunge. The hunters took a step back, struck by the sight of this half-wild woman, clad in a cloak of shimmering feathers. Nidiver, showing caution and tact, approached her unarmed, keeping his hands in plain sight as a sign of peace. He spoke to her softly, but the words held no meaningful significance for her, only their intonation. She slowly lowered her knife, sensing that these strange, noisy creatures were not going to kill her right away. The tension eased, but mistrust remained, hanging in the air like a thick wall between two different worlds. It was a meeting of civilization and primal nature, where neither side understood the rules of the game. They offered her their food, galley rations and hardtack, which seemed utterly tasteless and very strange to her. In return, she treated them to her tough, dried seal meat, demonstrating the primitive laws of hospitality. At that moment, she tried to speak, but only a series of incomprehensible, guttural sounds escaped her throat. None of the sailors, even those who knew Native American dialects, could understand a single word she uttered. Her tribe's language was irretrievably lost. She remained the last speaker of a dead tongue, forgotten by the entire world. She watched the receding island with the same vacant expression she had once worn as she watched the departing ship. The circle had closed completely. Strangers had returned her to the place from which she had been so cruelly torn in her youth. But she was not returning as a rescued victim, but as a creature from another, parallel, and wild dimension. They were not simply transporting a woman, they were transporting a living, breathing artifact of an era gone forever. And none of them realized that civilization would kill her far more quickly than the wild could have. Her arrival on the mainland, in the bustling city of Santa Barbara, was a colossal, unbearable sensory shock. The abundance of new sounds, bright colors, and unfamiliar smells instantly overwhelmed her nervous system, which had grown unaccustomed to such stimuli. Crowds of onlookers constantly gathered around Nidaver's house, eager to catch a glimpse of the legendary wild woman from the Lost Island. People tried to communicate with her, bringing in Indians from various tribes, hoping to find at least someone who understood her language. But all attempts proved completely futile. Her dialect had been lost forever, along with the disappearance of her people. She smiled and nodded, but her eyes revealed a complete, impenetrable emptiness and a profound lack of understanding of what was happening. Communication was reduced to primitive gestures, as if she were not an adult, but a small, frightened child. The rescuers' joy at having brought her back into society shattered against the wall of her absolute isolation. European food, which was new and completely unfamiliar to her readapted body, became a huge problem for her. Fresh fruits, vegetables, bread, and sweet wine were offered to her with the best and kindest of intentions by her hosts. But her stomach, accustomed to tough seal meat and shellfish, categorically refused to accept this new food. Her digestion was completely disrupted, causing severe pain and a rapid, catastrophic loss of her remaining physical strength. What was a common blessing for civilized people became the strongest, deadly biological poison for her. Her immune system, which had not encountered common viruses for 18 years, was completely defenseless against them. A simple bacterium that would have caused only a mild ailment in a European became a death sentence for her. She quickly fell ill with a severe form of dysentery, which began to rapidly drain the last drops of life from her. The body that had withstood icy storms and years of starvation was succumbing to an invisible enemy in a comfortable, warm bed. The local doctor's medicines did not help, only exacerbating her already critical, dying condition. Nidaver and his wife sincerely tried to save her, but they were utterly powerless against the laws of biology. They watched in horror as the wild woman faded away before their eyes, turning into a formless, gray shadow. A priest was invited to her bedside to perform the rite of baptism before her inevitable, imminent death. She was given a new name, Juana Maria, thereby erasing the last remnants of her true indigenous identity. She underwent this rite in a semi-conscious state, understanding neither the meaning of the words nor the significance of the ritual. In her final hours, there was no one nearby who could speak to her in her native, forgotten language. She left this world in the same absolute solitude in which she had lived for the past 18 years. Her breathing grew quieter and quieter until it stopped completely, leaving only silence in the room. Death took her easily and quickly, without the long struggle she had waged on the island for years. Her physical suffering ended, putting a final, somber period on this unprecedented story of human survival. She lived among people for only 7 short weeks after leaving her cold island. For 18 years, nature had tested her endurance, but it had never been able to break her remarkable body. Civilization, however, destroyed her in less than 2 months, offering comfort, but taking away the very ability to live. It was a paradox that shocked everyone who knew the story of this strange, silent woman in a feather cloak. Her return to the world of humans became a one-way ticket for her, a path to inevitable, swift death. She was buried in the local cemetery with a modest cross erected bearing her new, foreign, and incomprehensible name. The dress made of bird feathers, a symbol of her struggle and triumph over death, was sent to a distant museum. The personal belongings found on the island were scattered among private collections, becoming nothing more than exotic souvenirs for onlookers. Nothing remained of her except a beautiful, terrifying legend of incredible solitude at the edge of the earth. The world continued to turn, quickly forgetting the woman who had once fallen out of its familiar flow of time. She returned to the world to die, thereby proving the fragility of human nature in the face of change. San Nicolas Island remained in its place, washed by cold waves and buffeted by sharp winds. There, among the sand and rocks, a true part of her soul remained forever, the part she could not take with her. Her return was merely a physical movement of the body. Her spirit remained to wander among the whalebones. The story of her rescue turned into the story of her murder, committed with the kindest and best of intentions. This story will forever remain in memory, not as a tale of a miraculous rescue, but as a chronicle of doom. We often romanticize survival stories, expecting a happy reunion and joyful tears of relief in the end. But the reality faced by the last representative of the Nicoleno people was devoid of any noble Hollywood glamour. Juana Maria's fate clearly shows us that true isolation is not simply the absence of other people around. Isolation is the slow, inexorable destruction of one's identity, the erasure of memory, language, and all familiar social ties. The island was not her enemy. It was simply an empty stage on which this silent tragedy was played out. She survived physically, but emotionally she died right there on the shore, watching the ship sail away forever. Her return to civilization merely completed what nature had begun, delivering the final, crushing blow to her weakened body. Wild nature took its time killing her during those long 18 years spent in absolute solitude. The island did not try to tear her apart. It simply gave her the right to fight for every new breath herself. Nature is neither cruel nor merciful. It merely creates conditions in which the limits of human endurance are tested.